030. All right. So let's get to it. The Second Amendment. Before we can discuss if it's relevant or not, we got to take a look and see, what does it actually say? What rights does it give us? Why was it even put into the Bill of Rights? So let's do a quick history on this. So the Second Amendment is, of course, right after the First Amendment, and it's in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was the document that has 10 basic rights that were given to the people before the Constitution was ratified. Thomas Jefferson was a huge proponent of the Bill of Rights and wanted to make sure that this government that was now being formed was not going to be put in a position where it would become exactly what they had just gained their liberty from. He wanted to make sure that the people were going to be free as long as possible from a tyrannical government. So these basic rights were entered in to the Constitution through the Bill of Rights. And this is where we see the Second Amendment. So the Second Amendment, let me throw that up on the screen real quick. Let's just read it and see what it actually says. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That is our Second Amendment right. Now, keep in mind, the whole purpose of the Bill of Rights was to guarantee the basic rights of people. Before, I'm getting text, hold on. I'm only getting one text about sound. Some people have been having trouble with sound on YouTube. But you got, just go back and check it out. Let me see. Mic check on here. We got sound on this side. And I've only heard it from one person, so check your levels over there. So anyway, let me get back. So the Second Amendment was put in place to help us have rights and be protected against tyrannical rule. This is something that Thomas Jefferson communicated to James Madison, who is called the father of the Constitution and also the father of the Bill of Rights. It was something that was very important. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said this. Said, when the people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. He went on to say, a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inference. So, in other words, Thomas Jefferson is saying, look, if we're going to establish this government and give it powers to govern the people, we need to make sure that the government understands that it is there to serve the people, and it is not there to lord over the people. Now, of course, there are authorities, but those authorities are put in place by those who are elected by the people in order to carry out the basic rights given to us in the Constitution. So that is the whole purpose of it. Now, Thomas Jefferson goes on to say this in regards to the right to bear arms. He says this. Oh, hold on. There we go. He says this. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is as a last resort to protect themselves against tyranny in government. Let me read it again. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny in government. Now, that's a very plain statement that is made by Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers. And it gives clear intent to the purpose of the Second Amendment. And that is for the people to have a means of protecting themselves from a government that may turn into a tyrannical system of governance. We're supposed to protect ourselves against tyranny. That was the whole purpose. Now, you might be thinking, well, we're so far removed from that type of thing happening. Not so. If one thing that we learn from history is that we don't learn from history, and when governments start making moves to try and limit or overregulate the rights of the people to protect themselves, there is an ominous future ahead. So I want to take pause here, and in light of what we just shared, the purpose of the Second Amendment, I want to listen to some sound bites from President Joe Biden, some things that were recently said. So let's just have a listen here.
Our Constitution opens with the words, as trite as it sounds, we the people. Well, it's time to remember that we the people are the government. You and I. Not some force in a distant capital. Not some powerful force that we have no control over. It's us. It's we the people.
Okay. So Joe Biden just said, we the people are the government. Now, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and just say that he was just playing with words a little bit funny, as he often does. God bless him. And what he meant to say, or what he actually said, isn't what he really meant to say. But what he said there is that we the people are the government. The government is not we the people. We the people are the citizens. And the government is there to serve the citizens of the United States of America. When he says we the people is the government, he just bestowed all the powers and rights and privileges from that were there for the people onto the government. Now you may be thinking, well, that's just a play on words. He could have been meaning, well, we the people are the government. The people are the government. And I'm sure I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that that's what he meant. However, if it was a Freudian slip, and that is the actual intent behind the far left, it wouldn't be outrageous to believe that. This is, in fact, the way most leftist governments have moved in the past. We see the extremes of that in communism and extreme socialism, Marxism, where the government becomes the controlling entity over the people, imposing its laws on the people rather than enforcing laws to protect the people. We see this in communist China. We see this in communist Russia. We see this in Cambodia in the past. We've seen it all throughout history, and it never works. But here we are in the United States of America making subtle, small movements towards this type of governance, and it's dangerous. I want to listen to one more soundbite from President Joe Biden here. Take a look at this, and let's hear what he has to say about the Second Amendment.
Own them. And I might add, the Second Amendment from the day it was passed limited the type of people who could own a gun and what type of weapon you could own. You couldn't buy a cannon. Those who say the blood of patriots, and all this stuff about how we're going to have to move against the government. Well, the tree of liberty is not water with the blood of patriots. What's happened is that there never been, if you wanted to think you need to have weapons to take on the government, you need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons. The point is that there's always been the ability to rationally limit the type of weapon that can be owned and who can own it.
Okay. Well, excuse me. So he says, first of all, that from the moment that the Second Amendment was written, there were limitations on the types of guns and things that one could use, and that there was a limitation on the people. That's not actually true. When the Second Amendment was written, that was not specified at all in the amendment, and that didn't come until court cases that were several years later. So we'll talk about one of those court cases in a little bit, but that was not true. And he goes on to almost mock the Second Amendment, saying, well, if you're going to do anything against the government, you're going to need F-15s or some nuclear bombs. Now, again, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, and he's just there on the spot. He's not the best, off-the-cuff speaker at all. But just the notion, just the hint that, number one, you can't do anything about us because we have F-15s and atomic bombs is alarming, because it kind of gives the impression that you would be willing to use military jets and nuclear bombs on your own people. Something that the Democratic Party jumped on Trump over when he sent troops out to defend federal property, when the Democratic cities were letting people run amok and burn down their cities and burn down government buildings. they were jumping all over Trump saying, oh, you can't, send out troops against your own people or declare war against your own people. And now we have the President of the United States saying if you wanted to do something about us, you would have to have F-15s and nuclear bombs. So that shows that he does understand that there is a purpose to the Second Amendment. But it wasn't about just self-defense and hunting. As we stated earlier, that had nothing to do with it. It had everything to do with protecting the rights of the people against a tyrannical government, against a government that would slowly come in and try and take away the freedoms and liberties of the people. That is what the Second Amendment is there for, so that people can defend themselves. And we've seen examples of this disarming effort all throughout history. As soon as a people is disarmed by their government, they are soon afterwards attacked by that government. This is all throughout history. Let's take a look at just a few examples here. In 1911, Turkey disarmed its citizens, and between 1915 and 1917, they murdered 1.5 million Armenians. That was the first thing they did, was disarm the people, and then they went in and slaughtered them. 1929, Russia disarmed its citizens, and between 1929 and 1953, they murdered 20 million Russians, either by firearms or most of them. When Stalin came in, forced farmers off their land, and then withheld food from them, starving millions. 1935, China disarmed its citizens, and between 1948 and 1952, they murdered 20 million Chinese. They are still oppressing people now. They are still putting people in concentration camps. People are still dying under this evil regime. In 1938, Germany disarmed its citizens, and between 1939 and 1945, they murdered 16, it should be 6 million Jews. 1956, Cambodia disarmed its citizens under Pol Pot, and between 1975 and 1977, they murdered 1 million educated people in Cambodia. As a matter of fact, they murdered 21% of their population. 21% of their population was murdered after they disarmed their citizens. 1964, Guatemala disarmed its citizens, and between 1964 and 1981, they murdered 100,000 Mayan Indians. In 1970, Uganda disarmed its citizens, and between 1971 and 1979, they murdered 300,000 Christians. So listen, this is nothing new. When a government seeks to disarm its citizens, there is trouble. Now, you might be saying, well, when they wrote the Second Amendment, they weren't talking about AR-15s and semi-automatic pistols and all these different things. They were talking about muskets. I've heard that argument so many times from the left. And let's just put things in perspective here. It wasn't written with muskets in mind. It was written with balance in mind. The Constitution that was framed by our founding fathers was put in place so that there was a series of checks and balances. This is why there's 3 branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. They balance each other out. This is why there's 2 houses in Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. It balances each other out. This is why we have so many regulations that are put in place within our government so that there is balance. One of these balances is also found in the First Amendment, the freedom of the press. The press is there not to be used as a propaganda machine in order to push a leftist agenda. The press is there as a point of accountability to those who are in authority. That's why the press is supposed to be there. This is why the press is there in the First Amendment. Our freedom of speech is there in the First Amendment. So we have the right to voice our grievances against the government. The right to assembly, to peaceably assemble, is there so we can protest against government tyranny. The reason that we have, what they call a separation between church and state, but simply stated that the church shall not, the government shall not establish a formal church, is so that they don't use the church in order to control people and make them do what they want to do, like we saw in the Middle Ages that led to the French Revolution. This is why those First Amendment rights were put in there. And then the Second Amendment was there in order to help protect the First Amendment rights. So when they're talking about muskets and all this stuff, they're talking about balance, not the types of weapons. See, back then, everybody had muskets. It wasn't like the militia had one type of gun and then the military had a separate type of gun. Everybody had a musket with a bayonet on it. It was balanced. It was the same weapons. So as weapons have increased, then in order for the people to defend themselves against a tyrannical government, the idea is that you would have similar weapons so that you could defend yourself. Now, I'm not saying that the militia groups need to have nuclear bombs. No one foresaw that back in 1776 when we wrote the Declaration of Independence and we started forming our nation. Nobody foresaw that. But there should be a reasonable balance. If we go out there and we're going to protect ourselves with muskets, now that the Army has M16s and what have you, then that's not going to be a fair fight. So there has to be some level of balance. So the whole idea of, well, they were talking about, muskets and all that. I don't think that argument holds very much water at all. Now, the next aspect of this is what does it mean for us when we have the right to bear arms and we're seeing murders happen because of gun violence? That certainly wasn't in the thoughts of the forefathers either. But I think it's important to point out that when you hear some of the rhetoric that we hear in the media about taking away AR-15s and assault rifles, first of all, AR does not mean assault rifle. You can ask a lot of these people who are yelling and complaining about assault rifles. They don't even know what they're talking about. They don't even know what assault rifle is. They don't even know what AR stands for, AR-15, anything like that. But they're talking about some of these mass shooting events where people have used semi-automatic rifles in order to kill people, which is horrible, and no one wants to see that. But the problem with that is this. If they're talking about, look at how many people are being killed, AR-15s and rifles are not the primary killing weapon in the United States of America or even the world. It's simple handguns. It's simple handguns. So if they want to decrease the numbers here because there's access to more advanced weapons these days, then why don't you take away all handguns? Because handguns are responsible for the vast majority of murders. But all of these little steps that they're taking in order to slowly take away our liberties and our right to bear arms or make it more difficult, it's too reminiscent of that communist Marxist mentality that we're seeing all over the place in the United States of America. From the control of the media to Marxist organizations like Black Lives Matter that are coming into play and now influencing people on a mass scale, to now this toting of the idea of taking away our guns. Joe Biden's chief of staff, she wanted to come in and do mandatory gun buybacks. Australia, within a few years ago, they did mandatory gun buybacks. And guess what? Their crime has shot up 300% in Australia since they've done that. Why? Well, as Benjamin Franklin once said, an armed society is a polite society. And that is the truth. So the idea of let's keep all the murders down by making it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to get guns is absolutely ridiculous. And then we want to restrict law-abiding citizens on how they can actually use the guns to protect themselves. I mean, there's laws where you can't even have your gun loaded. You have to have everything kept separate. Well, what good is that when someone breaks into your home and you're a single mom by yourself, and now you have to take an extra 2 minutes to load your gun and get everything ready? By the time that happens, you and your children are already dead or held captive or whatever. That just doesn't make sense. So we're punishing law-abiding citizens for what criminals are doing. You make it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to get guns. Guess what? The bad guys are still going to get them. They're still going to get the guns. So what is the real answer that they're looking for? Now, let me back up a little bit and let's keep it balanced. I'm all for making sure that the people that are buying the guns, they're in a right mental state, that there's plenty of time for them to cool off, and that there's reasonable training before you get this gun. I mean, think about it. When my daughter wanted to go and get her driver's license, she had 6 hours of professional training behind the wheel. She had to go in and take a big long test, and it was secluded. No one could talk to you. And then you have to train for 6 months. Now you can take a test with someone there to check off all these points. And if you pass, now you get your license. So there's 2 tests involved, one behind the wheel, one written. There's 6 hours of professional training, and then 6 months of behind the wheel with a responsible adult. And that's just to get in your car so you can drive yourself to school. I don't think it's unreasonable to have similar measures in place for someone to own something that is designed to kill. Guns are designed to kill. That's the truth of it. So there should be a level of training there. And with that training comes a level of respect and understanding of the weapon and a reverence for it. My children, I've taught them how to shoot. I am a gun owner. And when they come of age, I teach them how to shoot. And I teach them when they're younger. I teach them first with Nerf guns. So they practice the safe gun rules. And then we go to BB guns. And then when they are at an age where I feel it's appropriate, I take them to the gun range and I teach them how to shoot a real gun. And with that power in their hands comes a level of respect and training. So now I don't have to worry about them acting crazy or being curious about it because they've been trained. There's evidence that this actually works. When you look at nations like Switzerland, who made it a point to arm their citizens after World War II, they have the third highest guns per 100 in the world. They're at 46 guns per 100 citizens in Switzerland. They're third behind Yemen, which is at 55, and the good old United States of America, which is at 89 guns per 100 citizens. Now, that's a little extreme. You know, in America, we like to go big or go home. But when the closest person to us, we're at 89 per, is at 55 per, that's a huge gap there. We love our guns in the United States of America. But most of them are in the hands of law-abiding citizens. It's the criminals that we need to look out for. But getting back to my point, is that when you have a culture that respects guns, you don't see the mass shootings. The last time Switzerland had a mass shooting was in 2001. And what is the reason for that? Number one, you've got a lot of people who have guns there. They have national shooting competitions. They have them for youth. So it's a part of their culture. So everybody knows that everybody there is trained and they have a gun. And again, going back to Benjamin Franklin, an armed society is a polite society. You're going to have people less likely to go out and try and use their gun when they know everybody around them probably has one too. That's just the reality of it. So there's that knowing that other people are armed, but then there's also the training that came along with it, so people actually respect it. So there's 2 aspects to that. You also see this in Israel. Israel, who, by the way, has about 6.7 guns per 100. And this is a nation that is surrounded by enemies, under constant threat of attack by terrorists and bombs. And every single person there is supposed to serve 2.5 years in the Israeli Defense Force. So you have every single human being there that is basically going to serve in the IDF. They're going to be trained with their guns. And while they're in their time of service, they have to have their gun on them at all times, whether in their military clothes or if they're civilians. So you walk around and you see people carrying the rifles around them at all times. But within their culture, it's understood that these weapons are there for their protection. So because there's training, because there's exposure to it, and it's done in a controlled manner, now you have less incidents of those types of shootings and that type of crime. In the United States of America, though, there's this fear that we all seem to fall under. And fear is a wonderful way to control people. So we want to make everybody afraid of guns. We want to make everybody afraid that if we don't have laws that make it difficult for law-abiding citizens in order to obtain guns, then we're going to have mass shootings all over the place. That's actually not true. The mass shootings occur when there's people who have a history of mental illness, or they have signs and evidence that there was a threat. Most of these mass shootings, there were signs of a threat ahead of time that no one paid attention to. A lot of these mass shootings are people that got these guns legally. Some got them illegally. But the point is, the philosophy here is that the gun is not the problem. It is the person who wields it. This is the philosophy that's held in Israel. They don't view it as a gun problem. They view it as a person problem. So again, this is why I'm not opposed to making sure that the person who is getting a gun is in a right state of mind and has proper training over an extended period of time. I personally, being a gun owner, I would not have minded if there was a little bit more for me to do in order to prove that I was trustworthy enough to walk around, well, not walk around, but own a piece of equipment that is designed to kill. Of course, in self-defense, but again, not opposed to that. But the reason people get a little antsy when they start imposing greater restrictions is because of everything else that goes along with it. The mindset and the culture that's being imposed makes it very reminiscent of other governments that have turned tyrannical and turned against their own people. So when we look at the fact that there's an agenda being pushed to promote atheism within our schools, combine that with the agenda to push for tighter regulations on guns, you can see why people would get a little bit nervous. Atheism and communism go hand in hand because in order for communism to work, the government must be God. So they have to kill God as best as they can in the hearts and minds of the people. This is why in our schools we see the attack on God. We see evolution, which makes no scientific sense at all, and I'll do a show on that later. We see this being pushed on our youth, pushed on these teens. So even if they say they believe in God, they live in a manner that denies his existence. So we have what's called practical atheism perpetuated within our schools, within our culture, and now we have this movement towards we don't want guns, guns are bad. The enemy is so subtle. If they're not going to come in like Stalin and Mao and just straight take the guns away, they're going to use psychological warfare to get us to hate the idea of even having guns. And that's a problem. Now, let's be honest. With 89 guns per 100 citizens, we are in no risk right now of everybody losing their guns. But the idea that they're proposing legislation to make it more difficult is alarming. In San Jose, California, for example, the local municipalities were trying to pass a measure that would impose a fee for gun ownership and continual registration of the gun. And if you missed that fee, didn't pay that fee, then they would come and confiscate your guns. See, that's a big issue for me. Because we're not talking about, vehicles or anything like that. We're talking about a constitutional right that we have to bear arms so that we can protect ourselves from a tyrannical government. Now that government wants to come in and impose fees and regulations on us to make it more difficult to own the guns. It's kind of like, yeah, you can own guns, but then we come in and we put so many restrictions on having ammo. So it's trying to find a loophole to disarm the citizens or to make it more difficult for them to have or own their firearms. So there's a big issue with that. And again, history teaches us that when a government seeks to disarm their people, things are not looking good. They're just not looking good. But now let's look at it from a biblical standpoint. Do we have biblical precedence for owning a gun? Now, let's keep in mind in context, in the Bible, they did not have guns. Back then they had swords, they had slings, they had bow and arrow. So the idea here is it okay to use weapons to defend yourself? And I've heard a lot of different arguments on this. I've heard some people say, well, if God is our protector, then why do you need a gun? So let's start with that one. If you have faith that God is going to protect you, then why would you need a gun? And at first listen to that, you say, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. Well, let's take that premise and let's apply it to everything else that God is. If God is my peace, then why do I need to sleep or make time to relax? Well, he is my peace, but I also need to make time to relax. If God is my provider, then why do I have a job? Why can't I just sit around and just trust and have faith that God's just going to drop food into my house, put gas in my car? My mortgage is just going to be paid just miraculously because God is my provider. No, God is my provider, but we co-labor together, and I go to work, and God gives me favor, and we pay the bills. So God is my provider, I still got a job. God is my peace, but I still got to rest. God is my protector, but I still got a gun. So the whole idea of if you have faith, then you shouldn't have to, well, that doesn't apply across the board. So we really can't stand on that as a solid biblical truth. The other idea is this. Well, in the New Testament, we're supposed to be more peacemakers. We don't see Jesus walking around with any weapons or anything like that. We don't see him fighting back against the Roman government. So why would we feel it's necessary to take up arms in order to fight? Well, that was Jesus's call. Now, I want to say plainly that the role of the church is to be peacemakers and to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is the role of the church collective. But we also see that God has put government in place. And he says specifically that they bear the sword in order to execute punishment on those who do wicked. Now, being in the United States of America, we the people, we are the governing force here under the law of the Constitution, which was written with the understanding that God's law, his natural law, supersedes all. So we being the ones who are supposed to be in governance and the government serves us, we have a right to defend ourselves. And in those times where tyranny tries to come in, the people have a right to defend themselves. Now you say, well, Pastor, where do we see Jesus talking about any forms of weapons in the scripture? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's take a look at Luke chapter 22. In Luke chapter 22, we see Jesus speaking expressly about it. Let me see if I can get this up on the screen. Is that going? Let me see. Give me 1 second. We're live here, so bear with me, people. There we go. Luke chapter 22, verses 36 through 38. Then he said to them, this is Jesus, but now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must still be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. So they said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. Now, before we start taking that too far and saying, whoa, look, the Bible says that everybody should have 2 swords. That means everybody should have at least 2 guns. That is not what I'm saying. Not at all. What I am saying is that Jesus acknowledged that there was a time to take up arms. That there was a time when you may have to defend yourself. And the disciples had 2 swords, and he said, that's enough, that's good. So we do see that there is the mention of, and even a blessing on, the owning of weaponry in order to defend yourself from Jesus himself. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people who have a lot of different, takes on the interpretation of that. I'm one where I just like to read the Bible for what it is and let it be. But if you have some insight on that, I would love to hear your insight on that particular verse. But aside from that verse, we also look all throughout the scriptures, from the Old Testament all the way through the book of Revelations, that God has often, because of the imperfections of this world and the fallen state that it is in, has empowered his people to work with weaponry in order to build his kingdom, defend against evil, and enforce his law. We see that in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we don't see it as much, but in the book of Revelations, we absolutely see a time of warfare coming. Jesus himself is going to come back with a sword that comes from his mouth and completely annihilate his enemies. And that was not just a figure of speech or a metaphor. There is a war that will go on, and the Lord himself will fight. So there is a time to fight. There is a time to defend. So for me, I own guns because I want to be able to protect my family. It is my responsibility as a husband and a father to protect my family. So I make sure that I'm equipped to do that. And yes, I protect them through prayer. Yes, I ask for the angels of the Lord to encamp around my family at all times. But I also know that God has given me a responsibility and enabled me to do that, and will give me what I need in order to do it.